NordVPN is becoming more than just a VPN. Threat protection will guard your device against malicious websites, malware, trackers, and intrusive ads, even if you're not connected to a VPN server at the time. Step up your cybersecurity and stay safe.
I invested £25,000. Today, that investment is worth £5 million.
Say hello to our hero, the Hydrogen Energy Release Optimizer. Limitless power, zero emissions.
Hi everybody, this is Crypto Rich working with you to get rich with crypto, filling our pockets with crypto profits. And this is my favorite video of the month when I get together with Tom Luongo and Alex Krainer and possibly Alexander Mercouris, although his life is crazily hectic because of stuff that's going on with him and the Duran channel. I'll have the links to Tom Luongo's stuff in the description below and also Alex Krainer's stuff. And I do recommend you follow both of them and each of them and all of them if you want to know the best analysis in terms of what's going on in the world, macroeconomics and all that business. The first 10 minutes first 10 minutes or so will be on YouTube. So Alex Krainer, no cussing from you. And Tom, not at all, Tom, not at all. You are a veritable convent school child.
Soul of discretion. Soul of discretion.
Right. Okay. All right. So I'm going to start. We haven't even created anything what we're going to talk about because once again, there's nothing going on in the world. But
hardly anything.
Hardly anything. Of all the nothings that are going on in the world, where shall we start with? Which nothing shall we start with?
Alex, why don't you just you start and we'll figure it out from there.
It's difficult to choose because there's so much going on. But let's start in Africa and then we can work our way to other topics. But I have been observing the events in Africa, and I find them nothing short of dismaying. We've had 8 coups in 3 years, and all of them have jeopardized French position in Africa, which as our listeners may or may not know is extremely important. People like Jacques Chirac, former president of France, and François Mitterrand, also a former president of France, at various times said that without Africa, France could be a third world country. Or I think that François Mitterrand pretty much said that France would mean nothing without Africa. And so now...
Alex, sorry, can I just say, just to complete that sentence, France would be nothing without its colonial extraction from Africa.
Yes, correct. So, Africa is where France got a lot of its cheap energy and mining resources from over the years, and some agricultural resource, produce. But more importantly, what we have to keep in mind is that all those resources, and we talked about this before, but it's important to understand and keep in mind that all those resources are far more important in terms of collateral that they represent for the Western financial system. Namely, if you control the political situation in the country, it's what they call the arbitration role. Then you have the decisive arbitration role in that country, which means that you get to decide who gets the oil, who gets the gold, and more importantly, who gets to turn them into financialized money flows through your banking system. So the principle of how our financial system works is that all the money in circulation in our societies represents debt. With no debt, there wouldn't be any money in circulation at all. And so to create money, companies have to go into debt, and individuals. And then, the bank, out of thin air, credits their account with the amount of money that they borrowed, and then that money is in circulation. Well, that credit is extended against collateral. So there has to be money, good collateral. Otherwise, you're just printing paper backed by nothing, and it will be worthless. And, once you have saturated your domestic economy, meaning, you built out the infrastructure, all the roads, all the railroads, bridges, dams, ports, airports. It's been built. People have homes, cars, second cars, third cars, clothes on their back. Food production is adequate. Your economy becomes saturated. It becomes harder and harder to convince people to keep buying more crap. And at a certain point, the credit impulse stalls. That's a huge problem because our monetary system is stable only insofar as it grows. The minute it stops growing and even growing at a certain rate, it begins to implode on itself. And at that point, the economy goes into the deflationary debt spiral. Deflationary death spiral, not debt. And in order to avert that from happening, you need to keep the credit impulse going. It has to grow. You have to give more loans, to put more money into circulation, to create more purchasing power. And if there's no demand for credit in your domestic economy, you have to go abroad and you have to financialize other people's resources and turn them into your collateral. So that means that, like you go into a country like Gabon, it's an oil-rich country, and let's say your company like Elf or Total get the credit to develop their oil resources. So that's collateral, and that's more credit allocated to your oil majors. And then they sell that oil in colonial French franc, which creates financialized flows in your financial system, in your banking system. And so that's how you keep it up. And then once you saturated that market, then you have to expand, which is basically the steps of how empires come about. They need to keep expanding. They need to keep adding collateral, putting the native populations into, cheap labor force and so on. And of course, then you set some of that money aside and you sprinkle some crumbs to those countries. First to your local oligarchs who, keep the system under control on your behalf locally, meaning you have corrupt government officials. That's where corruption originates from. And then, for public relations purposes at home, you give aid to those countries and you make a big deal out of it. You take $1 billion out of the country and then you go and you say we've given 10 million for school programs in Gabon where, young people will learn about the wonderful wonders of LGBT culture and that there isn't just 2 genders as they used to think, but there's 76 and things like that. And then, you think we're helping Africa. They're so backward and poor and their country is so corrupt. We need to go in there and help them out. So, you set aside a sliver of all that money that you extract and you pretend is extraction of wealth and turning them into financialized flow. Ultimately, the whole system acts like a giant vacuum cleaner that ends up concentrating wealth in the hands of the Western financial oligarchies. This is the same story, the exact same story, in different versions that's been repeating itself through history, at least since the times of ancient Greece. And the amazing part is that now this is all unraveling. And we've seen that, Gabon has had a coup. The French loyalist President Bongo, who together with his father have ruled the country since 1965, 1967. Yep. And, the equation is changing radically and we don't know what's going to happen. It's going to be bumpy. It's going to get tense and ugly. But I think that it would be extremely difficult for France. And, let's not single out France here. The Belgians, the British, the Americans, the Spaniards, the Portuguese have been doing the same things in Africa and other parts of the world, exactly the same thing. It's a bit convenient for them to demonize France today. But the point being is it's going to be extremely difficult for them to put this genie back in the bottle. the most recent news is that there have been social uprisings registered in Senegal, which has been relatively more stable. And the people are attacking French-owned businesses in Senegal.
Wow.
And more farther eastwards, Chad, which houses some French troops, have asked the French troops to leave, which complicates things again even more for France, because they were going to evacuate troops from Niger into Chad, and now Chad is asking them to leave. So I think that the French ruling establishment doesn't quite know how to respond to this. They are hoping that maybe the nations of ECOWAS, which is, Western Africa's equivalent of European Union and just as incoherent and corrupt, they're hoping that ECOWAS will intervene on their behalf, which essentially means Nigeria intervening on their behalf. Nigeria is resisting because they themselves are looking at possible civil war and social uprising if they should intervene in Niger. And so it's a mess, and it's not going the way of France. And ultimately, this is the collateral leaving the European banking system, particularly French banking system. And I think it's going to lead to a financial collapse unless the ECB keeps printing and backstopping all the debts that are never going to be repaid with freshly printed up euros, only with no collateral to back it up. And that's the recipe for hyperinflation. So we're looking at over the next few years at a future of accelerating inflation in Europe, and euro becoming worthless.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you. Tom, keeping to Africa, you want to add?
Well, yeah, no, Alex is exactly right about that. I'm glad he covered it that way so that he did it more coherently than I would have, because, sometimes I get lost in this stuff as well. No, the collateral issue is exactly correct. And France and the colonial powers all have to, they all concede the existential threat that this that represents, because ultimately, when this started with Burkina Faso and Mali and France didn't really respond, it's like everything else. Is once somebody takes the leap to challenge the colonial overlord, I keep going back to Putin moving into Syria in 2015. Yeah. The world was completely cowed by the Americans going about, like Rambo without a jockstrap, and going wherever they wanted to subjugate the locals. And Syria was that moment in time when somebody finally stood up and said, you know what, no, and then exposed the situation for what it was, exposed the lie for what it was, that ISIS was unbeatable because we weren't trying to beat them. We were actually funding them in order to take out Assad. And then once Putin moved in and started wiping them out, all of a sudden the narrative had to change. And that's what set us on this course. So the minute somebody stands up and goes, you know what? No, they're not that powerful, or no, the situation is not such that they can immediately come in and stomp us because we're the Russians and nobody wants to have World War III over the Syrian desert. They're over a pipeline. Therefore, Putin called their bluff, and everybody stood up and went, wow, they're right. And that raises everybody's expectations of what is possible. And it's a slow process of getting people to understand, oh, maybe we can get out from underneath these people. It's not all hopeless. It's not all, just wait for the whole thing to collapse and suffer in silence as abused children. Because that's kind of the dynamic here, right? Emotionally abused children just suffer in silence, waiting for the day that they can leave, or waiting for the day for the torture to finally end. So once you started seeing it like propagate across the Middle East, into Egypt, into they opened Libya back up, then they tried to blow up Lebanon, all this stuff, and Iran said no. Saudi Arabia eventually grew a pair and said, nope, that's enough. I'm tired of being triangulated by the Americans and the Brits against the Iranians. Yada yada yada. We start seeing the stuff start to pop up in Africa, and once the first one goes, then the second one goes, and France doesn't really respond, and the Americans don't come to the French's aid. Why? Because it's not really in the Americans' best interest, the American neocons' best interest, if the European Union is getting cold feet about destroying Russia, which they are. So the timing on all of this stuff is really important, because it's very clear that the European Union, as Alex just pointed out, is cognizant of their own end. What I like to call Davos is really, really worried at this point that one, they're losing all their collateral, two, they're losing control of their own financial system and political control that they have. And Ukraine is their Rubicon. And because of that, they're like, okay, that's enough, because we can see the gambit now. The Russians and the Chinese and everybody, and even the Americans, can literally financially bankrupt Europe and break it apart by the studious application of shorting their bonds or just selling their bonds across the board in such a way that Christine Lagarde can't stop it. This is the point I've been trying to make for a long time. So into this mess is what Alex is talking about, where what do you think Putin said to these 30 African leaders in early July?
That was part one of this fabulous conversation with Tom Luongo and Alex Krainer, recorded on Saturday the 9th of September 2023. Parts 2 and Parts 3 will be on 3Speak and on Odyssey. bit.ly/CryptoRich 3Speak and bit.ly/CryptoRich Odyssey. Links in the description below.